The Cold War was sparked shortly after World War II, and it created an intense rivalry between two of the world's great powers, the capitalist United States and the communist Soviet Union. In the late 1950s, space exploration became the newest area for competition, and each side sought to prove their superiority. This created what is known as the space race. On October 4, 1957, the Soviets launched the Sputnik, the world's first artificial satellite and man-made object to be put into Earth's orbit. Sputnik orbited the Earth and transmitted radio signals for 21 days, before burning up in the Earth's atmosphere. Sputnik 2 was launched the following month, carrying a dog named Laika. 6 months later, Sputnik 3 was launched, which weighed almost 3,000 pounds. As all three launches were successful, the Soviets sent Lunik 3, a space probe, to photograph the dark side of the moon. As the Soviets were the first to have a satellite in orbit and continued to have successes, the U.S. did not want to lose much ground, so space exploration was made a priority. The satellite Explorer 1 was launched into space by the U.S. Army in 1958, 3 months after the Soviets' first launch. That same year, President Eisenhower signed a public order creating the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA, which was a federal agency dedicated to space exploration. The National Defense Education Act was also created, which provided more funding for math and science education. In 1959, the Soviet space program took another step forward with the launch of Luna 2, the first space probe to hit the moon. In 1961, the Soviets also became the first to send a person into Earth's orbit, cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin, in a spacecraft called Vostok 1. The U.S. were not far behind, however, with Project Mercury. NASA engineers designed a spacecraft smaller and lighter than the Vostok, and final testing with chimpanzees took place 1 month before the Soviets' launch. 1 month after the Soviets' launch, astronaut Alan Shepard became the first American in space, though not in orbit. Nearly a year after the Soviets, John Glenn became the first American to orbit Earth. President John F. Kennedy then made the statement that the U.S. would land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. By the end of the year, the foundation of the lunar landing program, Project Apollo, was in place.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Due to Project Apollo, NASA's budget was increased almost 500%. It suffered a major setback, however, when 3 astronauts were killed after their spacecraft caught fire during a launch simulation. Meanwhile, the Soviets' lunar landing program slowed because of a debate over its necessity after the death of Sergei Korolyov, the chief engineer of their space program. In 1968, Apollo 8 became the first manned space mission to orbit the moon. A year later, on July 16, 1969, astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins embarked on Apollo 11, the first lunar landing attempt. On July 20th, they landed successfully, and Neil Armstrong became the first man to walk on the moon, with his famous exclamation, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
I'm going to step off the limb now. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
By being the first to land on the moon in 1969, the U.S. is said to have won the space race that had begun with the Soviets' first launch of the Sputnik in 1957. The Soviets made 4 attempts of a lunar landing over the 3 years after Apollo 11, yet never succeeded. From the beginning, the American public's attention was greatly captured by the space race, as developments by both nations were covered heavily in the media. The Soviets were thought to be as villains with their relentless efforts to surpass America and prove the power of the communist system. In 1975, however, the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission sent 3 U.S. astronauts into space aboard an Apollo spacecraft that docked in orbit with the Soviet Soyuz spacecraft. When the commanders of the two crafts officially greeted each other, their handshake in space served to symbolize the gradual improvement of U.S.-Soviet relations in the late Cold War era.